At Christmas, when most families gather to celebrate warmth and love, my own daughter looked me straight in the eye and screamed, "Pay rent or get out." That night, I stood in my living room surrounded by holiday lights and the smell of pine, realizing that the house I had built with my own hands no longer felt like mine. She thought she had the upper hand. She thought I would crumble, but she had no idea that I had a plan of my own, a plan that would turn her arrogance into regret. 1 week later, while she was still celebrating her so-called victory, I sold the very house she lived in for $750,000. She didn't see it coming, and when the truth landed, it shattered everything she thought she controlled. What happened next didn't just shock her, it shook the entire family to its core. I'm about to tell you exactly how betrayal, greed, and one bold decision at Christmas turned into the most unexpected revenge of my life. But here's the question I want you to think about: when your own child betrays you at your lowest moment, how far would you go to take your power back? My name is Daniel Miller. I am 60 years old, a retired carpenter who once built homes for other families while trying to keep my own together. For years, I believed Christmas was the one night when even broken families could pretend to be whole. I set up the tree myself that December, strung the lights, and baked gingerbread just as my late wife used to. I wanted to believe that smell, that glow, could still hold us together. The house carried her touch in every corner: the oak banister she insisted on polishing, the faded rug in the living room, the chipped ceramic angel at the top of the tree. It was more than a house. It was the last thread tying me to Margaret, the woman I had loved and lost too soon. I thought my children would feel the same way. I thought wrong. That night, the dining table gleamed with polished silverware and mismatched plates collected over decades. The roast sat steaming in the center, its aroma fighting against the tension that hung heavier than the scent of pine. Emily, my granddaughter, darted around in her red sweater, adjusting ornaments. She was the only one who still looked at me with warmth, the only one who saw me as more than a burden. Brian, my son, scrolled on his phone in the corner, thumb moving faster than any conversation he had with me. He didn't look up when I asked about his work. Karen, my daughter, paced by the window, lips tight, eyes hard. Patrick, her husband, stayed quiet as always, the kind of man who kept his head down and let his wife's voice fill the room. The moment broke when Karen turned on me. Her voice sliced through the clink of glasses and the rustle of napkins. "Pay rent or get out," she shouted loud enough for the neighbors outside to hear. Emily froze her fork mid-air. Brian didn't even flinch, as if he had been expecting it. Patrick lowered his eyes, pretending to study the gravy boat. I felt the words like a slap through her hand. "Never touched me." I had bought this house with my own 2 hands, signed the deed with money I earned after years of labor and sacrifice. I had kept it standing through storms, through repairs, through losing Margaret. Yet in that moment, my daughter spoke as if I were a guest who had overstayed his welcome. She looked at me like I was a guest in my own house. "Pay rent or get out." The sentence echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls I had built. My chest tightened, not from age, but from betrayal that felt older than my years. I glanced at Emily. Her young eyes were wide, brimming with questions she didn't dare ask. I wanted to shield her from the ugliness, but the truth had already spilled across the tablecloth. Brian gave a small shrug, as if this was just another squabble, nothing worth his time. Patrick shifted, cleared his throat, but said nothing. Silence is its own betrayal. The gingerbread I had baked earlier lay untouched on the counter, its sweet scent mocking me. The lights on the tree blinked cheerfully, a cruel contrast to the storm rising in my chest. I remembered the deed locked away in a drawer upstairs, my name etched across the paper, a truth no one in this room seemed to recall. I wanted to tell her then. I wanted to slam the papers down on the table and remind her whose roof sheltered her, whose hands had built these walls. But I bit my tongue. Revenge, I thought, must be patient. The night was not the time. Let them believe I was powerless. Let them see me as old and broken. Because when the truth came, it would come like thunder. And in that silence after Karen's shout, I felt the first rumble of it forming inside me, waiting for its moment to break. The memory of Karen's shout still burned in my ears long after the table had gone quiet. That night, when the others retreated to their rooms, I sat alone in my study with only the hum of the furnace and the faint twinkle of the Christmas lights outside the window. My hands trembled as I reached into the bottom drawer, pulling out a plain envelope worn at the edges. Inside was a truth I had hidden for 2 decades, a truth that could turn every word spoken against me into dust. I unfolded the papers slowly, tracing the ink with my finger. Franklin Daniel Miller. Owner. The house was mine, purchased outright in 2004. The year I stumbled into luck I never told anyone about. It wasn't millions, not the fairy tale kind of fortune, but a lottery win large enough to change the course of a life. Margaret and I had stood in that kitchen, ticket in hand, laughing like children as we realized what it meant. No more rent, no more scraping to make payments. We could buy a home that was truly ours, and we did, this very house. Margaret's face came back to me in the dim light. Her smile soft, her voice steady. This house will be the anchor, Daniel. Promise me it will always be home. I promised her. I swore it the day we signed the deed. I meant it the day we carried boxes through the front door and set our lives inside these walls. Even after she passed, I kept that promise alive. I guarded it like a soldier guards a flag, folded and sacred. Yet as the years rolled on, my children grew hungry not for love, but for money. Brian, with his endless business schemes, always one step away from collapse. Karen, with her sharp tongue, demanding more every month under the guise of bills and taxes. Each time they asked, I gave what I could. Each time they mocked me, I bit my tongue. I told myself that silence was peace, that revealing the deed would only turn them more bitter. So I stayed quiet, carrying the truth like a hidden weapon. I remembered the first time Brian asked for money. He had just lost his job at Midwest Freight, his eyes darting around the room as if guilt might land on his shoulders. Just a few thousand, Dad. You've always helped before. I gave it to him thinking it was temporary. But temporary became routine. Later, when Karen cornered me after Margaret's funeral, her voice tight with grief and calculation, she asked for a loan to cover her mortgage. I agreed, thinking kindness would heal her heart, but kindness became expectation. Every demand chipped away at me, but I never revealed the truth. To them, I was a man living under their roof, eating their food, clinging to relevance. They thought the power was theirs. They thought I was dependent. They had no idea. I held the envelope tighter, the papers rustling like dry leaves. For 20 years, I carried a secret like a loaded gun. It sat in the drawer, cold and silent, but ready. Each insult cocked the hammer back another inch. Each shout, each dismissive glance, each sigh of irritation from Karen or scowl from Brian was another finger pressing the trigger. And one day I knew the gun would fire. Sometimes I wondered if Margaret would forgive me for my silence. I had promised her to protect this home, but I had let our children believe it belonged to them. I had let them treat me like a tenant in my own fortress. I imagined her voice, gentle but firm, asking why I allowed such disrespect. My answer was always the same. I kept quiet for peace, but peace, I realized now, had only bred contempt. The longer I stared at the deed, the more my resolve hardened. I could hear the echo of Karen's words from earlier: pay rent or get out. The bitterness in her tone wasn't about survival. It was about control. Control she thought she held over me. She didn't know the foundation she stood on was mine, paid for by the numbers on a lucky ticket, by the sweat of my work, by the love of a woman who believed in me. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each second a reminder that time was running out on my silence. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows, the branches scratching like fingers demanding to be let in. Somewhere in the house, a door slammed, Karen moving angrily through the rooms she thought were hers. I looked back at the papers, folded them carefully, and slid them into the envelope. Not tonight. Not yet. But soon. I placed the envelope back into the drawer, but this time I left it near the top, within reach. For years it had been buried under bills and old photographs, but now it needed to be ready. The storm had already begun, and when it broke fully, I would not be caught unarmed. The furnace groaned, the lights flickered, and I sat in the darkened room with only my thoughts and the secret that had kept me prisoner. My pulse slowed, but my chest felt tight with the weight of decisions waiting to be made. I whispered into the silence, to Margaret, to myself, "It's time, Maggie. They need to learn." Upstairs, footsteps creaked across the floorboards. Karen's voice carried faintly sharp and impatient. I closed my eyes and listened, the envelope still burning in my mind. Soon they would know. Soon the loaded gun would fire. And when it did, no one in this family would ever see me the same way again. Brian came first, his footsteps heavy on the porch, his knock more of a demand than a request. I had barely finished my morning coffee when he barged into the kitchen, Melissa trailing behind him with downcast eyes. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Dad, I need $5,000, just until the next load comes through." His voice carried the tone of a man who had asked too often and never repaid. I looked at him calmly, my hands folded on the table. "No, Brian. Not this time." His face turned red, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you're teaching me a lesson? You're just an old man hoarding what little you've got left." He slammed his hand against the table, rattling the coffee cups, then stormed out, Melissa whispering apologies as she followed. The door shook in its frame, leaving me with the silence of his anger lingering in the air. No sooner had I caught my breath than Karen appeared, heels clicking like gunshots against the hardwood. She dropped a stack of bills onto the table, the envelopes fanned out like weapons. The electric, the water, taxes, insurance. "You're not pulling your weight, Dad. Either pay up or I'll make arrangements for you." Her eyes were cold, her smile sharper than broken glass. I stared at the papers, knowing every figure was exaggerated, every total a rope she was trying to tighten around my neck. "Arrangements?" I asked, my voice steady. She leaned closer, her perfume stinging my nose. "A nursing home. There are facilities in town that would take you, and once you're there, we can finally breathe." That night I wandered the hallway and stopped when I heard whispers behind the half-closed door of Karen and Patrick's room. Her voice was low but laced with triumph. "Once he's in a home, this house is ours." Patrick muttered something about timing, about making it look like the right decision, but Karen cut him off. "Don't worry, he's too old, too tired. He won't fight." The words pierced deeper than Brian's anger, deeper than the bills shoved in my face. They weren't just dismissing me, they were erasing me already, dividing what they thought was theirs. I pressed my back to the wall, my heart thundering louder than their whispers. It was betrayal in its purest form, calculated and cold. The very children I had raised were plotting to lock me away like an inconvenience, a piece of furniture moved to storage. I clenched my fists, feeling the weight of the envelope upstairs. the deed that was my shield and sword. They believed I had nothing left, that I was powerless. They had no idea the ground beneath them was mine. The next morning, Emily found me on the porch, the cold air biting at our faces. She sat beside me, pulling her jacket tighter. "Grandpa, you look tired. What's going on?" Her eyes searched mine, full of worry no one else bothered to show. I forced a faint smile. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart." She shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "I hear them, the way they talk about you. It's not right." Her words were a balm and a burden all at once. She saw too much for her age, understood too much of the rot inside this family. I wanted to tell her everything, to place the envelope in her hands and let her see the truth. But I stayed silent, my revenge still forming, still waiting for its moment. Instead, I told her to focus on school, to live her life. She kissed my cheek before leaving, whispering, "Don't let them push you around." I watched her go, the only light in a house full of shadows. As the day wore on, the weight of their schemes pressed heavier on my chest. Brian's rage, Karen's threats, Patrick's silence, all circling me like vultures. But in that suffocating pressure, something else stirred resolve. The envelope upstairs was no longer just a secret. It was a weapon, and the time to use it was drawing closer. That night, as the Christmas lights blinked mockingly from the tree and Karen's laughter echoed faintly down the hall, I sat in my room with the drawer open, the envelope resting on top. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper and I whispered into the quiet, "If they want war, they'll get one." The house groaned in the winter wind, as if it too knew a storm was coming, one that would shatter every illusion of power my children thought they held. The words I whispered to myself that night still echoed in my chest the next morning. If they wanted war, they would have it. But a war fought in silence, with papers and signatures instead of fists and shouts. I walked through the house, slowly touching the banister Margaret once polished, staring at the photographs lining the hall. Each step carried the weight of decades, yet also the urgency of what I now knew I had to do. They thought they could corner me, strip me of dignity, reduce me to nothing more than a wallet. They were wrong. By mid-morning, I had called an old acquaintance, Tom Grant, a realtor I trusted from years back. He met me at a diner in town, the kind of place where the smell of bacon and coffee clung to the air. Tom was younger than me, but had a sharpness in his eyes that made you believe every word. After a few pleasantries, I leaned in, my voice low. "Tom, I'm thinking of selling." His brows rose, then a slow smile crept across his face. "Daniel, you picked the right time. Market's hot. Homes like yours, they don't stay on the market more than a week." His words should have felt like opportunity, but instead, they sat heavy on my shoulders. This house wasn't just wood and stone, it was Margaret's laughter, Emily's giggles when she was small, Christmas mornings, where wrapping paper flew like confetti. Could I really put a price tag on all that? I stirred my coffee, watching the cream swirl like clouds in a storm. "It's not easy," I admitted. Tom's tone softened. "I know, but sometimes holding on does more harm than letting go." That night I sat alone in the living room. The Christmas tree blinked mockingly, each flash a reminder of the family gathered under this roof, who saw me not as father, not as grandfather, but as an obstacle. I could still hear Karen's hissed words through the door. "Once he's in a home, this house is ours." My fist clenched around the arm of the chair. They wanted the house more than they wanted me. They measured my worth in bills, not blood. And if the house was the battlefield, I would take it away before letting them win. I went upstairs and opened the drawer again, pulling out the deed. The paper was worn, but my name was clear, bold, unshakable. Margaret's voice came back to me, a whisper from another time: "Better to lose bricks than lose yourself." She had always known that love wasn't in walls or paint, but in dignity and respect. I had honored her promise by keeping the home. Now, perhaps I would honor her by letting it go. For hours I sat in that room, torn between memory and betrayal. Every corner of the house told a story, but every insult from my children told another. The scales tipped slowly, the weight of cruelty outweighing nostalgia. When the clock struck midnight, I finally whispered to the shadows, "I don't want to die as their wallet." "Let it go." The words lifted from me like chains breaking. The next morning, Tom met me outside the house. He walked the property with a keen eye, jotting notes, snapping pictures. Karen passed by the window, glaring suspiciously as she spotted us on the lawn. I could almost hear her mind spinning, calculating. Patrick stepped out briefly, his hands shoved in his pockets, asking Tom what he was doing. Tom smiled politely but gave no answers. I saw Karen pull Patrick back inside, their silhouettes tense behind the curtains. Tom turned to me with a firm nod. "You ready, Daniel?" My throat tightened, but I nodded back. "List it." The pen felt heavy in my hand as I signed the agreement, but when the ink dried, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving under their roof, I was reclaiming it. That evening, the air inside the house felt different. Karen's voice was sharp at dinner. Brian muttered about money. Patrick kept his slunts. But none of it pierced me the same way. They still thought they held the reins. They had no idea I had already cut the leather. I tucked the signed papers back into the envelope, now fatter with purpose, and slid it beneath my pillow. The storm was building. They would learn soon enough. As I turned off the light and lay in the dark, the faint sound of Karen's voice carried from down the hall, demanding, plotting, assuming. I closed my eyes, a small smile tugging at my lips. She didn't know that the foundation under her feet was already shifting, that the home she claimed was hers was already promised to another. Tom wasted no time after I signed the listing papers. Within 2 days, he called, his voice carrying both urgency and triumph. "Daniel, I've got a cash buyer lined up. They want it fast, no contingencies, no delays. If you agree, we can close before the year's out." His words filled me with a strange mix of dread and satisfaction. This wasn't just a sale anymore. It was a strike. Every tick of the clock brought me closer to the moment my children would realize their kingdom was built on sand. Still, I knew better than to show my hand too early. Karen and Brian were hawks circling for weakness, ready to swoop if they sensed anything unusual. So I began what I called spring cleaning, though it was the middle of December. I filled boxes with old coats, books, dishes Margaret and I had collected from flea markets decades ago. Every scrape of cardboard against the floor sounded like a secret, every sealed box another step toward freedom. Emily watched once or twice, her brow furrowed, but she said nothing. Perhaps she understood more than I gave her credit for. The tension in the house thickened with each passing day. Karen grew sharper, snapping about bills, muttering about taxes. Brian was still sulking from my refusal, stomping around like a teenager rather than a grown man. Patrick kept his distance, though I could sense him listening when Karen ranted late at night. I stayed silent, steady as though nothing had changed, all while the biggest change of all inched closer. It was Doug, my neighbor across the street, who nearly tipped the scales. He caught me one afternoon carrying a box to the garage, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Cleaning early for spring," he joked, tugging at the brim of his cap. I forced a smile. "Just clearing some space." He nodded, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Funny thing, saw Karen's name on a refinance flyer. Bank sent it to me by mistake. She trying to pull something behind your back." His words struck like a hammer. Refinance. I repeated, my voice steady though my gut twisted. Doug shrugged and reached into his jacket. He handed me the flyer, a glossy paper with bold letters. Refinance today, lower your payments, and there, clear as day, was Karen's name typed neatly in the homeowner section. I stared at it, the paper shaking slightly in my hand. Rage and clarity washed over me at once. So this was her game. While she barked about nursing homes and unpaid bills, she was scheming to chain the house with debt it never needed, to strip it of the one thing that made it secure. Margaret's voice came back to me again, sharper than ever. Better to lose bricks than lose yourself. Selling was no longer just an act of revenge, it was salvation. By the time she learned, the deed would already be out of reach. I thanked Doug quietly, folding the flyer and tucking it into my pocket. "Appreciate you telling me," I said. He gave me a long look, the kind neighbors give when they know more is at play than you're willing to admit, then nodded and went back across the street. I stood there a moment longer, the winter air biting through my coat, gripping that paper like it was proof of every betrayal rolled into one. Inside, the house felt smaller, its walls closing in with the weight of deceit. I imagined Karen filling out forms at the bank, smiling as she planned a future without me. I imagined Brian eager to take his share once the house was locked under another loan. Their greed was suffocating, their vision short-sighted. But mine was clear now. The sale was no longer a question, it was destiny. That night, I placed the refinance flyer next to the deed on my desk. One was a lie, the other the truth. Together, they told the story of a father dismissed, manipulated, but not defeated. I whispered to Margaret's memory, "You were right. This isn't just revenge, it's rescue." I returned the papers to the drawer just as Karen's footsteps passed in the hall. She paused, perhaps sensing something before moving on. I sat in the dim glow of the desk lamp, my heart pounding but my resolve unshaken. Tom's buyer was waiting. My children were plotting, and I, for the first time in years, held all the cards. The phone rang late that evening. It was Tom again, his voice brisk. "Daniel, they want to set a date for closing. Can you be ready in 10 days? I looked at the drawer, at the secret plans, at the shadows shifting beyond my door. My hand tightened on the receiver. "Yes," I said. My answer was calm, but inside me the storm gathered strength. What none of them knew was that the moment Karen tried to tighten her grip, the house was already slipping through her fingers. And when she found out, it wouldn't just be too late, it would be irreversible. Karen noticed first. It was small things at the beginning: a box missing from the attic, a stack of coats no longer in the hall closet, photo albums that had sat untouched for years, now gone from the shelves. She came into the kitchen one morning, eyes narrowed, lips pursed, and dropped a question like a stone in a still pond. "Dad, where are all those things going?" Her tone wasn't casual. It was sharp, probing, as if she were already convinced there was an answer she wouldn't like. I looked up from my coffee, steady as stone. "Just things I don't want to leave behind." My voice was even, almost bored, and that calmness seemed to irritate her more than any confession would have. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, searching my face for cracks. But I gave her none. I had learned long ago that silence and composure can rattle a person more than shouting ever could. Patrick wandered in, still half asleep, tugging at his tie. He sensed the air between us heavy and electric. "What's going on?" he asked, though his voice lacked conviction. Karen spun toward him, her eyes flashing. "He's been moving things. Have you noticed half the boxes in the garage are gone?" Patrick shrugged, his gaze darting away. "Maybe he's just cleaning." The words fell flat, unconvincing even to himself. He poured coffee and busied his hands, clearly unwilling to take sides. Brian arrived not long after, stomping mud off his boots. He caught the tail end of the argument and rolled his eyes. Are we seriously doing this? Dad's probably just hoarding junk again. Who cares? But when Karen pressed harder, demanding details, Brian's irritation flared. He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the mugs. If you've got something going on, just spit it out. We're not your audience for mind games. His anger was heat without direction aimed at me, only because it was easier than facing his own failures. I met his glare calmly, refusing to rise to the bait. It's just spring cleaning. I repeated, my tone smooth, deliberate. I watched the words land. Brian huffed and turned away, but Karen didn't move. She stared at me, unblinking, her suspicion sharpening like a knife. The silence stretched until even Patrick shifted uncomfortably. Karen finally leaned closer, her voice low and steady, each word clipped. What are you hiding, Dad? Her eyes locked on mine, unrelenting, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. For a moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder, the hum of the refrigerator more pronounced. I felt Margaret's voice in my mind again, reminding me that patience was power. So I gave Karen nothing, just the calm mask she hated most. And as her suspicion deepened, as Brian muttered curses under his breath and Patrick looked anywhere but at me, I knew the cracks in their control were beginning to show. That night, I heard Karen on the phone in the next room. Her voice, sharp, urgent, almost panicked. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught fragments, refinance timing before the door clicked shut. The pieces began to fit together. She wasn't just worried. She was plotting, scrambling to keep hold of something already slipping through her fingers. I returned to my room, slid the envelope out of its drawer, and held it beneath the lamp's glow. My name was still there, bold and undeniable. They could glare, accuse, shout, and plot, but in the end the truth rested here in my hands. Still, Karen's question echoed in the back of my mind. What are you hiding, Dad? I whispered the answer she would one day learn too late. Everything. The question Karen hurled at me days before still lingered in the air. But she got her answer sooner than she could imagine. On a brittle December morning, the crunch of tires in the driveway broke the uneasy silence of the house. Through the window I saw Tom's SUV pull up, and behind it another car, one I recognized instantly. It was the Johnsons, the family next door. Karen had sneered at for years, mocking their old minivan, their mismatched holiday decorations, their modest lives. And now they were stepping onto the porch of the house she thought was hers. Tom's knock was brisk, businesslike. When I opened the door, his smile carried the weight of a done deal. Daniel, I'd like you to meet the buyers. The Johnsons stood behind him, their breath visible in the winter air, their faces a mixture of excitement and disbelief. They looked around the living room with wide eyes, reverent as though stepping into a long-denied dream. Karen appeared almost instantly, her heels clicking on the floor like the countdown of a clock. She froze when she saw who was there. Her voice cracked shrill with outrage. Them! You sold our house to them! She spat the word "our" with venom, her face red, her body trembling. I looked at her steadily, the calm that had so unnerved her before now sharpened into finality. It's not our house. It never was. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the faint jingle of the Christmas music still playing from a forgotten radio. Tom busied himself with the walkthrough, pointing out the polished hardwood floors, the solid foundation, the features I had once been proud of, and now surrendered with purpose. He pulled the sign from under his arm, a bold red board with white letters, "Sold." When he planted it in the front yard, the weight of it echoed louder than any gavel, final and absolute. Karen's shock twisted quickly into fury. She lunged toward me, her voice a scream that carried through the walls. You've ruined everything. This was supposed to be ours, our future, our security. Patrick hovered behind her, pale and quiet, as though realizing too late he had tied himself to a sinking ship. Brian stormed down the stairs, his face flushed. "Dad, you can't do this. You can't just hand it over to them." His voice broke with desperation, more fear of losing his imagined inheritance than love for the home itself. I said nothing more. I didn't need to. The deed, the contract, the sold sign, all of it spoke louder than I ever could. Emily lingered by the doorway, her eyes flicking between me and the chaos unraveling around her. She didn't smile, but I saw something in her gaze, respect, maybe even relief, that told me she understood. The Johnsons walked quietly through the kitchen, their fingers brushing the countertops, their voices hushed with awe. To them, this was hope fulfilled. To Karen, it was humiliation. She turned on them, her words dripping with contempt. "You don't belong here. This house is too good for you." But the irony was sharp as glass, because the house no longer belonged to her at all. The Christmas tree in the corner blinked on its cheerful lights, grotesquely out of place amid the storm. Ornaments shook as Karen slammed her fist against the table. "How could you betray us like this?" she screamed. Her voice carried through the open door, and neighbors walking past slowed to stare. The humiliation was public now, uncontainable. I straightened my shoulders and looked her in the eye, unflinching. "I didn't betray anyone. You betrayed me when you tried to turn me into a tenant in my own home. You betrayed me when you whispered about nursing homes and plotted behind closed doors. This house was never yours to lose. It was mine to give away." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The truth had stripped her bare in front of everyone, her family, her neighbors, and the very people she had scorned. Brian muttered curses. Patrick avoided my gaze, and Karen stood frozen. Her fury now mixed with something worse, shame. Tom finished the tour and shook my hand firmly. "They're excited to close, Daniel. Congratulations." The Johnsons smiled gratefully at me before stepping out into the yard, their laughter carried by the cold December wind. Karen's eyes followed them, wild and desperate. "You'll regret this," she whispered, but her voice no longer held power. It was the hiss of a candle being snuffed out, fragile and fading. As the door shut behind Tom and the Johnsons, the silence left behind was deafening. The tree lights flickered, the radio crooned faintly about joy and cheer, but the room felt stripped of festivity, hollowed by the weight of what had just happened. Christmas was no longer about family. It had become a stage for their downfall. And yet deep inside I knew this was only the beginning. The sale had exposed the truth, but consequences ripple farther than the first wave. What Karen, Brian, and Patrick would do next was uncertain. But I could see it in their eyes. They weren't finished fighting. The phone rang in the other room, sharp and sudden, cutting through the silence like a blade. Everyone turned toward it, tense, waiting. And I felt in my gut that whatever waited on the other end of that line would push this storm into its next stage. The cold bit at my cheeks as I pulled into the driveway, the envelope from the title company resting on the seat beside me like a weapon. Inside were the closing papers, the ink still fresh, my name etched as the sole owner who had just sold the house. My hands tightened on the steering wheel before I killed the engine. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times, but nothing could prepare me for how quickly it would explode. Karen was waiting by the window, her eyes sharp as glass. She swung the front door open before I even reached the steps. "What's that?" she demanded, pointing at the envelope. Her tone was more command than question. I didn't answer. I simply walked past her into the living room and placed the envelope on the table. The air turned electric. She lunged forward, snatching it up before I could react. Her fingers ripped the flap open, her breath quick and ragged. She pulled out the stack of documents, eyes darting across the lines, then froze on the bold letters, owner Daniel Miller. Her face drained of color, then flushed crimson. You sold it. You sold it without us. Her voice cracked into a scream loud enough to shake the ornaments on the Christmas tree. Brian barreled down the stairs 2 at a time, his face red, his fists clenched. You bastard, he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. You had no right. He lunged toward me, his body a storm of fury. For a moment I thought he might land the blow. But then Emily stepped in front of me, her small frame rigid, her voice shaking with fire. Enough, she shouted louder than I had ever heard her. This house was Grandpa's, not yours. The room went silent for a breath, everyone stunned by Emily's defiance. Brian's arm froze mid-air, his rage colliding with the undeniable truth spoken by a child who had seen through all their lies. Karen's lips trembled, her hands still gripping the papers, her knuckles white. Outside movement caught my eye. The Johnsons had paused on the sidewalk watching. Then another neighbor stopped, then another. Within minutes, a small crowd gathered on the edge of the driveway, drawn by the shouting. Their faces were curious, then pitying, then judgmental as Karen's shrill voice carried into the winter air. The humiliation I had long endured in silence was now theirs to bear. Karen's voice broke the moment. She shoved the papers back at me, her eyes wild. You can't do this to us. Her scream rang out over the lawn, echoing into the ears of everyone watching. It wasn't anger anymore, it was desperation. The kind that comes when power slips away and nothing can be done to stop it. I straightened my back, my voice calm, steady, and final. I already did. The words cut sharper than any knife, final and irrevocable. Karen staggered back as if struck. Patrick pulled at her arm to steady her, and Brian lowered his fists, his chest heaving with helpless fury. Emily stood tall in front of me, her hands clenched, her eyes burning with a mix of fear and For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. The crowd outside murmured the shame settling on Karen and Brian like a heavy cloak they could never shrug off. But as the neighbors whispered and pointed, I caught a glimmer in Karen's eyes, something darker than rage. It was calculation, cold and dangerous. She wasn't done, and as I closed the envelope and tucked it back under my arm, I knew the battle had been won, but the war was not yet over. The sound of sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing closer. Someone had called the police, and with flashing lights on their way, the next stage of this family's unraveling was about to begin. The flashing lights faded as the squad cars pulled away, leaving only the cold silence of the neighborhood. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispers trailing off into the winter night. Inside, the air was thick with shock and rage, Karen pacing like a caged animal, Brian sulking with fists still clenched, Patrick keeping his head low. I held the closing envelope tight against my chest, steady as stone. The deal was done, the ink dry. What they didn't understand yet was how airtight the law was on my side. The next morning, Tom came by with the buyers. He carried a folder under his arm in the calm assurance of a man who had seen this all before. In the driveway, he explained the terms with professional clarity. It was a cash deal, closed in full yesterday. Daniel's the only name on the deed, and that deed has now transferred. The Johnsons own the property free and clear. To ease the transition, Daniels agreed to 30 days for move-out cash for keys arrangement. It's generous, frankly. His eyes flicked toward Karen, whose jaw tightened with fury. Karen exploded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. We'll sue. You think you can just sell the roof over our heads without even asking? We'll take you to court, Dad. You'll lose everything. She waved her hands wildly as if her anger alone could rewrite the law. Tom didn't flinch. He pulled the deed from the folder and handed it to her. You can try, but it won't go anywhere. Daniel bought this house outright 20 years ago. His name is the only one that's ever been on the deed. Your threats won't stand a chance in court. The law is clear. Karen's face crumpled as her eyes scanned the document. Each line was another nail sealing her defeat. Brian cursed under his breath, muttering about betrayal and greed, but there was no fire behind his words anymore, only the hollow echo of loss. Patrick shifted uneasily, as though realizing he had married into a family that had just been stripped of its illusions. Emily stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly, watching all of it unfold. When the shouting finally ebbed, I crouched down beside her, lowering my voice, so only she could hear. This was never about hurting you, sweetheart. You've been the only one who's seen me, truly seen me through all of this. I reached into my coat pocket and pressed a smaller envelope into her hand. There's money set aside for you. Enough to help you start fresh, go to school, chase what you want, away from this mess. Her eyes widened, tears welling as she clutched the envelope to her chest. Grandpa, she whispered, her voice breaking. Karen noticed and lunged forward, but Emily stepped back, her grip firm. For the first time, she didn't flinch under her mother's glare. She looked at me, then back at them, and her voice rang out clear and strong. This house was never yours. It was his, and now it's gone because you treated him like a stranger. The words landed heavy, undeniable. Even Brian looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Karen turned back to me, her voice ragged, desperate. You call this justice? You've destroyed your family. You've destroyed us. Her chest rose and fell with fury, her eyes wild, her face red with humiliation. I met her gaze, steady as a mountain. You call it betrayal, I said quietly, each word cutting through the tension like a blade. I call it rescue. The silence after was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of the sold sign flapping in the winter wind outside. For a moment, none of them spoke. Karen's rage faltered. Brian slumped into a chair, Patrick rubbed his temples, and Emily stood tall, her chin high with pride. The tables had turned completely, yet I knew this story was not over. The anger simmering in Karen's eyes was not the end of her fight, but the beginning of a darker resolve. That night, as I locked my bedroom door and set the closing papers on the desk, I caught sight of Karen through the window, standing alone in the driveway, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, hushed, dangerous. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Whatever came next, she was already plotting it. After the shouting, the threats, and the slammed doors of those final days, the house on Maplewood Lane no longer belonged to me, and for the first time in decades I felt both lighter and lonelier. Karen and Patrick scrambled quickly, their pride dented but not destroyed, to sign a lease on a cramped duplex across town. I heard it through the grapevine, neighbors whispering about how the once proud daughter who used to boast of her big house now hauled boxes into a place where the paint peeled and the yard was nothing but weeds. Brian didn't even bother with leases or stability. He packed what little he had and vanished into the night, leaving Melissa to field questions none of us wanted answered. I didn't ask where he went. Maybe I already knew. Some sons run toward responsibility, others run from it, and Brian had always had his running shoes laced tight. I left too, but with a different purpose. My new apartment wasn't much, just 2 small rooms on the 3rd floor of a brick building near the edge of town. The elevator rattled, the carpet in the hall smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. But when I stepped inside that bare space, it was mine. I unfolded the worn photograph of Margaret, my wife, and set it gently on the dresser. Her smile filled the room more than any furniture ever could. For the first time since she passed, I felt like I was breathing in a place she would have approved of. No shouting, no demands. Just silence broken by the hum of the radiator and the occasional sound of children playing in the street below. Each morning I carried my coffee to the small window and watched the world wake up. The sky no longer felt heavy. I still carried sorrow, but it was mine alone, not a debt collected by ungrateful hands. In the evenings I unpacked slowly, placing books on shelves, folding sweaters into drawers, making order out of years of chaos. When I finally hung Margaret's photo above the small table, it was like closing a circle I had kept open too long. I whispered to her the same words I had carried silently through all the betrayals. I kept my promise, Maggie. I protected what mattered, even if it meant losing everything else. Then Christmas arrived again, quieter but somehow fuller. The streets shimmered with lights, neighbors left small wreaths on their doors, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon from the bakery down the block. One evening, as I returned from the store, I found an envelope tucked under my door. Inside was a card embossed with holly leaves and a message written in neat, careful handwriting. It was from the Harrisons, the family who had bought my old house. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Miller," it read. "You're always welcome in this house." I sat at the table, the glow of the string lights I had hung in my window reflecting in the glass, and for the first time in years, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with dignity. Yet even as I traced the words with my finger, I knew the story wasn't over. The card was kind, but it was also a reminder. Karen's anger hadn't cooled, Brian's desperation hadn't vanished, and Patrick's silence was heavy with unfinished battles. Families don't break clean, they fracture and linger like echoes that refuse to fade. I leaned back in my chair, the card still open before me, and wondered not if the storm would return, but when and in what shape it would come. The Christmas card still sat on my table when Emily came by with 2 paper bags of groceries. She laughed when she saw I hadn't touched much in the fridge and insisted on cooking for me. The small apartment filled with the smell of garlic bread and tomato sauce, and for a moment the clatter of pans felt like music instead of noise. We sat down together, just the 2 of us, and I couldn't help but think of Margaret. I remembered how she used to hum carols while stirring gravy, her hands quick, her eyes always flicking toward me with that little grin that said, "We built this together." Watching Emily smile across the table, I saw both her mother and her grandmother in her, and I felt a warmth that no deed or dollar amount could buy. As we ate, Emily asked quietly if I missed the house. I put my fork down and thought carefully. "I miss the memories, not the walls," I said. She nodded, her eyes shining with understanding far beyond her years. I told her about Margaret, about the promise I made to her that our children would always have a place to call home. Then my voice broke a little as I admitted that sometimes giving too much only teaches people to take more. Emily reached across the table, squeezing my hand, and I knew she understood more than Karen or Brian ever would. Later that night, when Emily left for her dorm, I sat at the desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. My hand trembled as I began writing to Karen. I didn't fill the page with anger or accusations. I simply wrote what needed to be said. Respect is earned, not demanded. I reminded her that money could pay bills, but it could never purchase dignity. I told her I hoped she would one day see the difference. When I folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was release. The next afternoon, Doug knocked on my door. He carried a small box of cookies his wife had baked and grinned as if we were old friends. "Frank," he said, "what you did took guts. Most men would have rolled over, let their kids walk all over them. But you drew the line." We sat by the window sipping coffee, and he listened as I admitted how heavy it had been to hold on to the truth for so long. He shook his head, muttering, "You saved yourself. That's more than most people ever do." His words made me realize something I hadn't dared to say out loud. When Doug left, I stood by the dresser staring at Margaret's picture. I whispered I wanted respect more than their money. Saying it out loud felt like carving it into stone. It was the answer to every sleepless night, every slammed door, every insult that had been hurled at me. I hadn't fought for dollars. I had fought for my dignity, and I had won. The victory didn't erase the pain, but it gave it purpose. That night I lay awake, the city sounds drifting in through the window. For the first time, I didn't fear the silence. But even in that quiet, I knew the story wasn't finished. The letter to Karen would reach her soon, and with it another storm might rise. Whether it brought reconciliation or more fire, I couldn't yet know. As I closed my eyes, I felt both peace and unease. The battle for respect was won, but the war of family was far from over. The letter to Karen had been sent. Doug's words still echoed in my mind, and Emily's visit lingered like a balm. One evening, I stepped out onto the small porch of my apartment as the sun dipped low. The sky blazed orange and purple, the kind of sunset that made even cracked sidewalks look like they belonged in a painting. I sank into the old chair I'd bought secondhand, feeling its creak beneath me. And for the first time in years, the silence around me felt like a friend instead of an enemy. The city hummed in the distance, but here on my porch I had peace. I leaned back and closed my eyes, and suddenly I heard it again. Karen's voice, sharp as broken glass, shouting, "Pay rent or get out." That moment, once a wound, now played in my memory like a line in a play whose ending I already knew. My lips curved into a slow smile. They thought they had stripped me of everything, but in truth they had freed me. Losing a house wasn't the end. Losing self-respect would have been. I had chosen the better loss. I thought of Margaret, her laughter filling the kitchen, her hands slipping into mine on winter nights, when the world seemed crueler than it should be. I promised her I would guard the family's foundation, but I realized too late that a house is not the same as a home. A deed can sit in a drawer, but respect must live in the heart. Watching the sunset, I whispered, "Maggie, I think you'd understand." I kept myself whole even if I let the walls go. The memory of Brian storming out, Karen's fury, Patrick's silence. They no longer weighed me down. They were proof that I had stood firm, and Emily, my one bright spot, carried forward the lesson without me having to hammer it into her. She saw it in my actions, not my words. That knowledge gave me more pride than any inheritance ever could. I shifted in the chair, letting the cool air brush my face, and I said the words out loud as if engraving them into the twilight. Better to walk away with dignity than stay as a man no one respects. The sentence hung in the air, simple, unshakable, and true. The porch light flickered on, and I knew life would move forward from here. Bills would still come, mornings would still arrive, and Christmases would still pass without Margaret by my side. But I had won something they could never take back. Dignity doesn't come with a price tag, and it doesn't sit on a bank statement. It is carried step by step in the choices a man makes when no one applauds. I picked up the Christmas card the Harrisons had sent, reading their invitation once more. I could visit the old house if I wanted, but I realized I didn't need to. It wasn't about reclaiming bricks or timber. It was about proving to them and to myself that I had the courage to say no, to refuse to be reduced to a wallet, to remind them that respect is not inherited like furniture. It is earned over years by deeds both small and large. As the last streaks of daylight faded, I found myself wondering about forgiveness. Karen might never apologize. Brian might never grow up. Patrick might never speak his mind. The wound of their betrayal would scar but never fade. Still, I had to ask myself the question that now I leave to you. If it were your child, would you forgive, or would you do the same as me? When I look back on this story, one truth stays with me. It's better to lose bricks and wood than to lose your dignity. My daughter thought she could strip me of everything, but in the end, she only taught me what was truly priceless self-respect. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts below. Do you believe forgiveness is the higher road, or do you think standing firm and walking away with dignity is the only way? I want to hear what you would have done in my place.